So I'm here to talk about the AC30 CC series, the Custom Classic series, that were manufactured between 2005 and 2009. Of course, I know all about the allure of the vintage AC30 amps. I've in fact worked with one that was absolutely fantastic in the studio. But you can't discount the modern AC30s. For instance, the CC series and the C series as well has the master volume, which is extraordinarily useful. It's unbelievable how loud an AC30 is, especially when you start turning it up to get a little bit of grit. So if you don't have a soak, the master volume is very useful, and I think it sounds very musical. I'm going to talk about these three switches that are not as obvious on the amp, and about a few other things that I've discovered along the way of owning an AC30. And we're going to start that now with a little tour of my AC30 CCH head. Here we go. All right, so here's my current setup. There's the AC30 CCH head, and that's a custom cab I've had built with two Celestian Blues. Miking it with just a simple SM57 today. Okay, I'm going to approach the head. Just a few quickie things here. You know, in terms of the versatility of the amp, you've got the normal channel and you've got the top boost channel. The normal channel is great as a pedal platform. It's got a tone of its own. And when you crank it up, it definitely breaks up in a very different way from the top boost channel. Also, you can blend the two channels here, and you don't have to physically jumper the two channels. You just use the blend switch. And here's the very useful master volume. And, you know, I just have to comment on the treble and bass controls are very interactive. And so it's amazing the versatility of the amp just based on the tone stack. And you can never forget how important this tone cut is. So to me, the tone cut is actually the treble content of the amp, the high treble content of the amp. And the funny thing is, you know, here it is, it's off, and you get the full high-end content of the amp. It actually doesn't on this series, the CC series, it doesn't actually do anything until you get into this upper part of the knob. Only then does it start rolling off high content. So you've got to really experiment here. I don't really hear it doing anything here. So treble content here, and to me, this treble knob, to me, is more of the mid shift, what's happening with the mids, at least when the amp is in standard mode. So there you have it. I'm just going to move around to the other side of the amp now. Okay, so what are the three mysterious switches we're talking about? We'll say the first one would be for the top boost channel, this EQ switch. So you're going between standard and custom. So from what I understand, the standard is like a vintage AC30, where the treble and bass knobs are very interactive, and to me, you're moving where the mid scoop is with that setup. How they describe the custom side of the EQ switch is it's more like the hand-wired series from a certain era. So I think it is that the treble and bass are more traditional, and maybe you guys can comment on this if you want, that the mids are more or less fixed. So that's the first switch that I want to experiment with. The next one, going down to the back of the amp, would be the bias switch. So you can't really see it here, but in output bias, we're going between warm and hot. So up on this switch here is warm and then down is hot. From what I understand, this is tube bias, and hot is what a traditional AC30 is, and warm is just taking some load off the tubes. And what I've heard in rumors is that in hot mode it operates at its full wattage, 30 watts. They're rumored to be much louder, AC30s. And then when you switch it down to warm, you're going down to roughly 22 watts. So I'm going to be, testing what that switch does. And then the next switch over, we're going between vintage and modern. So that's filtering of the amp. So supposedly in modern, it's a little bit tighter, the tighter bottom end. Vintage is more of a traditional AC30. So I'm going to experiment with moving that switch as well. So those are the three switches I want to talk about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up some guitar in a looper. That way it's the exact same part that's played with the switches up and down. And that will be the experiment. So here we go. Another thing I should mention is I won't use any effects on the front end of the amp, and no post-production, no compression, because that would probably influence if there's a volume change. So the only kind of influence hopefully we'll get is the upload to YouTube and its potential compression, and that'll be it. So I'm going to try and keep it as straight up as possible, because the changes with these switches might be pretty subtle. And, even if we don't get any results, it might be because I have the amp at too low of a volume, but we may see some interesting results. So let's see what happens. Here we go. So here we are at the EQ switch. It's set to standard now. I'll run the loop once and then I'll stop it, and then I'll switch the EQ to custom. Okay, now I'm going to move the switch over to custom and play the same loop again. Okay, there you have it. I can't tell much from here, but I'll have to listen to the playbacks to see if there's what kind of difference there is. Cheers. So here's the test for the bias switch. So first we'll have the bias set to warm. Here we go. Now I'll move the switch over for a hot bias. I heard the background noise go up, which suggests that we're getting a little bit more volume. Here we go. And there you have it. Now we'll move on to the next test. Okay, so now we're going to do the filtering test. So we're going to start in vintage mode. Here we go. I'm going to pull the switch over to the modern mode of filtering. Make sure I've got it. Yep, it's switched over. And now I'm going to run the looper again. Even from behind the amp, I can hear a difference in the bottom end. Very interesting. So I thought it was worth mentioning the guitars used for these demos. For the first test, I used a 2003 SG Special. For the second test, I used an early 90s, 50s reissue Japanese Strat. And for the third test, I used an early 90s, 50s reissue Japanese Telecaster. Before we discuss the results, I thought it'd be worth prefacing with a few points. First of all, it's worth listening in a really good pair of headphones or studio monitors because the outcomes are quite subtle. The amp master volume was only at around 9 o'clock, so I was never really working the power tubes too hard, so that could be affecting the results. A thing that we're not taking into account is the actual way that the switches affect the feel of the amp. So that's not something we can see with these tests. And finally, I'd have to say that I was pleasantly surprised at the differences in results. The differences are more than I would have expected. So the first test was for the Tone Stack standard custom switch. So where the bass and treble controls were set for this test, what I noticed is when I was in custom mode, the tone seemed smoother. So where the mids were and where the highs were presented. So it was almost like a better rock tone to me in custom mode. But it's, again, a function of where that treble and bass knob were to be set. But nevertheless, there was a big difference and I could hear it in headphones as well as in studio monitors. On to the second test, the tube bias switch. So I normally leave that switch in the warm position in hopes to have the tubes last longer. So it was interesting to run it in the hot position to see what we would get. What I found in the hot position is we seem to have a little bit more headroom. The amp was breaking up a little less and the tone sounded a little fuller and maybe a tiny bit louder. But let's keep in mind, because the master was at 9 o'clock, we're not running the output tubes to full efficiency, and the bias is actually for the output tubes. So probably if you were running the amp with the master all the way up and just a bit of preamp gain, you would see a bigger difference when rocking the switch back and forth. But I definitely still heard a difference with this switch. Okay, to wrap up, the filtering switch, or I think it's called the smoothing switch, which is either in a vintage or modern mode. I found that in modern mode, it almost sounded like the bottom end was more compressed, whereas in vintage mode, there was more imaging, I would call it, on the bottom end. But either option was very interesting, and I could hear that in headphones and in speakers. Potentially, the modern setting would be better for a rock Marshall style tone, I would say. But I think it's all experimentation in the end. So there you have it. And after all that talk about the Vox Custom Classic, if you still want to hear more, I've been using this amp for my demos for the last 2 years, so feel free to check out my channel and subscribe.